Good day, everyone. Welcome to the QEM Heroes webinar series. My name is Christine Wood, and I serve as the Assistant Program Director for the Heroes Fellows Program at QEM. And for more than 30 years, QEM has been a national catalyst for STEM education transformation and research capacity building. Currently, the QEM network serves nearly 900 colleges and universities and reaches more than 8,000 individuals nationwide. This webinar is part of the HEROES initiative. The HEROES program brings together former federal scientists to lend their expertise and support to the STEM research and education communities. Our fellows are here to provide tools and tips for navigating the funding landscape, developing STEM programs and partnerships, and improving talent retention in in-demand fields. We hope this series promotes engagement with our HEROES fellows and provides valuable resources to our participants. As a note, the webinar recordings and slides will be available in the QEM Resource Hub. By attending this webinar, you will soon be added to the QEM network and granted access to the hub. And I am so honored to introduce our fellows today. Dr. Toni Danstep uses her PhD in system science and developmental psychology to advance equitable informal STEM learning research and practice. Toni has led over 100 research and evaluation studies in collaboration with brilliant practitioners, academics, artists, and community members. Her work has explored the impacts of informal learning for people of all ages and has spanned topics including social justice, metacognition, spatial reasoning, and environmental and social science. With deep applied research methods and design expertise, Toni has experience as a primary investigator and lead researcher, an evaluation consultant, and a program officer for STEM education funding programs. And Dr. Toya Jones-Frank is a mathematics educator, researcher, and STEM education leader with a passion for creating just and equitable learning opportunities. She recently served as a program director at the National Science Foundation, where she led national initiatives in racial equity in STEM education and data science core. She also served at George Mason University as an associate professor of mathematics education leadership and secondary education. As a published author and sought-after keynote speaker, Dr. Frank has shared her expertise with organizations such as the Association of Mathematics Teacher Educators, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, and the Psychology of Mathematics Education, North America. Beyond her scholarship, she collaborates with teachers, leaders, and mathematicians across the U.S. and abroad. Dr. Naomi Hall Byers is a social psychologist whose work examines social, cultural, and contextual factors that drive health and educational inequities among historically marginalized groups. For 16 years, she was a professor of psychological sciences at Winston-Salem State University, where she directed the Race, Culture, and Context Lab. She previously served as a program director and acting deputy division director in the Social and Economic Science Division of the Directorate for Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences at the National Science Foundation. Dr. Hall Byers holds a PhD in applied social psychology and an MPH in maternal and child health, with expertise in social and behavioral sciences, mixed methods, and evaluation. And Dr. Tori Rolak Smith is an engineer and an educator whose career includes roles as a faculty member, researcher, administrator, and program director in higher education and government. She led teaching and learning, curriculum, advising, research, recruitment, and corporate engagement initiatives in her 14 years at Howard University. Tori also worked for 8 years at the National Science Foundation, serving as lead program director for the Eddie Bernice Johnson Includes Initiative and program director for the Historically Black Colleges and Universities undergraduate program and the Faculty Early Career Development program. She views her work, past, present, and future, as the convergence of professional expertise, lived experience, and enduring commitment to identifying, implementing, and studying innovation and participation in STEM education and careers. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to our presenters today.
Thank you, Christine. Welcome, everybody. We're grateful you are here with us. All right, so this presentation is part of our year-long series on capacity building for applied STEM education and behavioral sciences research. Today's presentation, we're focusing on 3 methods for conducting research with community: participatory action research, community-based research, and research practice partnerships. Just a quick disclaimer, the House if you have questions, they should be answered in the icons below, but just as you're looking at that, just want to share that all of the views expressed in this webinar are our own and are based on our own personal experiences and don't represent the federal government or QEM or anyone other than ourselves. So there have been several QEM webinars introducing community-focused research, including a session in March with panelists describing their own research with communities. And we really strongly encourage you to go into the Resource Hub and watch those. Today, we'll provide kind of a brief recap of the rationale for conducting research with communities. But our intention with this webinar is to dig deeper into these methodologies and share their core principles, their common methods, and their strategies, and then to give you experience with how each methodology might approach a specific research topic. So community-focused work requires this shift in perspective from traditional methods that place the community as the subject to be studied to an active partner and collaborator in the research. This really means going from research on to research with, going from consultation to shared decision-making, and from informing communities after the fact to co-creating with communities. And you'll see how each of these three methods do this work. Working with communities who are impacted by our research topics strengthens the research in a variety of ways. So, for example, it leads to stronger problem framing and study design, better recruitment, retention, and interpretation. And all of that leads to enhanced validity, that is, accuracy that's grounded in reality, and relevance of findings, and a greater likelihood that the results will translate into real-world change. The impacts of this work can be really quite humbling and awe-inspiring. And then also improved ethics by giving equal value and voice to the insights, experiences, and complex conditions of communities and practitioners who are impacted by the work. So that's the why research with communities. We will use the Flint water crisis to establish examples of these community-focused methodologies. So as a quick reminder, the Flint, Michigan water crisis began in 2014 when public officials switched water sources to save money. This led to contaminated public drinking water, which public officials spent far too long working to deny and cover up, and really inexcusable harms on physical and cognitive community health. So we will use this topic to have each of you consider how you might design research with these three methodologies. So before we do that, I'll give an overview of research practice partnerships. These are long-term, mutually beneficial collaborations between researchers and practitioners, so teachers, schools, districts, community-based organizations, the people developing and implementing learning experiences. The development of research practice partnerships began with the use of research problem that was in the 1970s through 1990s. This is really concern about the gap between research and practice in education had a long history, but it started to intensify in the late 20th century as both federal investment in educational research grew, alongside persistent evidence that the findings weren't changing much. So scholars had found, and researchers found that that the kind of instrumental use was really rare. That is, the here's a finding, now change your practice. That wasn't really happening. So this planted some good seeds that if research wasn't going to be used the ways researchers intended, maybe the production process itself needed to shift. So it's from this space that research practice partnerships emerged, not from a single intellectual tradition, but a collision of forces. Practitioners being frustrated with unusable research, researchers being frustrated with irrelevance, federal pressures that the work needed to have societal impacts, and a generation of scholars committed to doing something better. And whereas participatory action research and community-based research drew their deepest roots from social movements and liberation traditions, which Toya and Naomi will get into in a moment, research practice partnerships really drew theirs from inside the education research establishment itself. So in some ways, that makes it a more institutional intervention, and in other ways, kind of a harder one to sustain without ongoing intentionality about power and equity. So some core principles of research practice partnerships. The first is long-term trusting collaborations with intentional strategies to shift power relations and ensure equitable partnership and shared decision-making. The second is mutually beneficial goals, which include assurance that practitioners are able to meet their own goals and improve their own practice in ways that they find useful, while also ensuring that the research is designed using theory and methods to inform the field beyond the partnership. And then there's the joint work. The real focus of research practice partnerships is this joint work with use-inspired and context-responsive research and dissemination designed to inform both the practice and the larger field. And then finally, the final core principle is intentional capacity building, where researchers, practitioners, policymakers kind of cross vocational boundaries to gain experience in each other's roles. This builds both empathy and understanding of one another's work, and the collaborative joint research work becomes kind of integral to how all of the partners do their work. And that helps maintain momentum and sustain the partnership and the partnership's impact. So some common research methods in research practice partnerships. These RPPs have been heavily influenced by the 1990s design experiments in education. And that was research conducted in real classrooms, in real schools, and iteratively, where the intervention was being refined at the same time it was being studied. So common methods in research practice partnerships include design-based research, which develops and tests innovations through innovative processes involving both design and research. In addition to the innovations, the products of design research include new theories of learning, new learning goals and theories of how to support them, as well as theories of design. Another common approach or method is implementation research, which really looks at variations in contexts and seeks to develop explanations and strategies for how, when, why, and for whom policies and programs can be thoughtfully and effectively implemented. And then the last one I'll share is rapid iterative testing and improvement cycles. This is commonly, a common version of this is the plan, do, study, act cycles. And it's really in a localized real world setting, trying different solutions and measuring their impact and continuously refining. So kind of back to those design experiments. And then within each of these, teams often use two approaches. The first is mixed methods, which integrates both qualitative and quantitative research techniques to answer multiple aspects of the research agenda and converge on findings. And the second is joint data analysis, which really requires that researchers and practitioners are able to view, interrogate, and interpret data with equal facility and clarity, and to work together to integrate their viewpoints and reach a greater understanding. So some strategies for successful implementation in research practice partnerships include partnerships that are intentionally organized to connect diverse forms of expertise and experience and shift those power relations in order to ensure that all partners have a say in the joint work. Goals that emerge from the partnership, that is, they are not predetermined by the researchers, and that the goals evolve over time as the collaboration is sustained. Co-identified possible solutions and research questions, which are informed by practitioners' expertise and experience and prior research and theory. This is really where the beauty of the synergy between the researchers and practitioners come into play to something you can't imagine without working together. And then working together to iteratively investigate and interpret findings. And then the final strategy is shared dissemination, designed to inform and impact both practice and a broader field. So we're going to ask you to come back to the Flint water crisis and imagine yourselves in the headspace of a long-term researcher and librarian research practice partnership in Flint, Michigan. And we want to ask you to think about, we'll spend about 30 seconds in silence, and then where you'll just be thinking about what kinds of research practice partnership questions or approaches might you consider when your neighborhoods are starting to face contaminated water. What work can researchers and librarians do together? So we'll give you about 30 seconds, and then we'll ask that you start posting in the chat, and then we'll highlight some responses and give an example ourselves. Okay. Please go ahead if you have some ideas, throw them in the chat for us. The kinds of approaches you might, thank you, come up with. Nice. So working together to explore how other communities have approached problem solving. Awesome. Conducting interviews with families and organizations in the community. Nice. Just give it one more second and then I'll share ours. Identifying experts in the community. Nice. Yeah, so you've been speaking with the grassroots leaders that communities respect to gain contextual insights. Interviewing the politicians who made the choices and investigate their backstories and finances. All right, I'm gonna jump into ours, but thank you for engaging. And I think there's also some pieces where Toya and Naomi will push harder on the action-oriented approach, where that is integral to those two topics. Whereas research practice partnerships, that's not necessarily part of how they work. So the example we had was, what supports can libraries provide to patrons to facilitate drinking water testing, understanding, and of results and potential impacts, and personal decision making. So this would help develop an understanding and add to the literature of public health communication and engagement, and identify ways that libraries can provide similar supports in future crises. I think your examples of how libraries and researchers can be part of those larger interviews or conversations with people out in the world are also good examples. And so some examples I did add, ideally these conversations and this collaboration would include policymakers and local water commissions if they were willing to engage ethically. And then that researchers and librarians, in order to do this work through an RPP, might develop and deliver easy to use home test kits, infographics, and interpretation stations at local libraries. So I'm going to push it over to Toya, who will kick us off with thinking about participatory action research.
All right, thanks so much, Tony. So I'd like to speak with you briefly today about participatory action research, which we often call PAR. So PAR involves community members, where RPP focuses on those working in systems like teachers, librarians, etc. PAR involves community members as co-investigators who help define a problem, collect and interpret data, and use findings to drive meaningful change. The research process itself is considered a form of action, and it is cyclical rather than linear, as it moves continuously between inquiry, reflection, and action, but always centers the community. So the term action research was coined by Kurt Lewin in the 1940s, and he argued that research should be tied directly to social change rather than simply producing knowledge for its own sake. So he created the cycle of plan, act, observe, reflect, which many say laid the foundation for PAR. So again, he termed coined the term, excuse me, action research. And I think it's important to note that action research is a term used loosely across education, management, nursing, social sciences, etc., in ways that are not always compatible with PAR, participatory action research, and PAR's core commitments. So clarifying those distinctions helps researchers identify where their work actually sits. For instance, I have taught a course before on teacher action research, which can be, but it is not always related to PAR. Um, it's important to note that Paulo Freire brought the most transformative political dimension to PAR through his work in adult literacy education in Brazil. His landmark text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which was published in 1968, argued that knowledge is never neutral and that research conducted on marginalized communities without their voice is a form of oppression. Freire's concepts um, highlighted that people develop power through naming and analyzing through their own reality and their own lens. And this is foundational to how PAR understands the relationship between knowledge and liberation. It's also important to note that feminist and indigenous research traditions of the 80s and beyond further expand PAR's ethical and epistemological foundations. Feminist scholars like Patricia McGuire challenged PAR's tendency to overlook gender dynamics within participatory framework, and indigenous scholars, including Linda Tuhuwai Smith, whose seminal text Decolonizing Methodologies in 1999 became an important text because it argued that research with indigenous communities must center indigenous knowledge systems, sovereignty, and self-determination of indigenous people rather than simply adding community input to Western research frames. So together, these lineages constitute PAR and its non-traditional research methodologies. And some would consider it both a set of methods, a set of values, as well as a set of political commitments to the idea that communities most affected by a problem are those best positioned to understand it and solve it. Next slide, please. So, next, I'm going to talk a bit about the core principles of PAR. So you see participation and co-ownership, action orientation, critical reflection cycles, and power sharing and positionality. I would say that what holds the cycle together are these commitments, because PAR is rooted in partnership and respect and a shared commitment to creating equitable and just communities. So social justice is always foregrounded in PAR. It is built around a cycle rather than a linear process, and the structure itself is a value statement. So the research community inquires together as a group. They reflect critically on what they find, they act on it, and then they start the cycle again. And so what holds the cycle together are these commitments that participation means genuine co-ownership, not just consultation with a community, and that action is the point and not a hopeful byproduct of some research. And that power, meaning who holds it, who shares it, and how it shifts over a research relationship, has to always be considered and be a part of the conversation. So researchers are asked to name their position, share their power, and to be accountable to the community that they serve and are doing research with throughout the process. And that's a thread running through these four core principles of PAR. So positionality is not something that PAR researchers state briefly in their methods section. It's something that as a researcher, one should continue to return to throughout the entire research project. Next slide. One important element of PAR that I thought was important to discuss is YPAR, Youth Participatory Action Research, because it's not just simply PAR applied to young people. YPAR has its own methodological commitments. And one of those, and the primary one, would be skill building. So in YPAR, young people learn how to interview, analyze data, and present findings. And they also learn that capacity building is understood to be inseparable from the research process itself. So YPAR encourages building young researchers as they do research. The institutional context also matters. Most YPAR happens inside schools or youth serving organizations. So YPAR happens inside schools or youth serving organizations where adult authority and structures are present. So YPAR does something that PAR doesn't always have to do. It creates genuine conditions for youth voice inside of institutions that are structurally designed to support young people, but it shifts them toward listening to young people, not just serving and supporting young people. Again, it emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s. It is also rooted in Freirean traditions. And this work, similar to the PAR movement, grew out of work with young people in community organizing contexts. Next slide. So across the various PAR and YPAR projects, there are some methods that are common. So some of these may look familiar, like interview maps and workshops, but in PAR, they function differently because a community interview conducted by a trained community member produces different data. And we talked about this in our March and April sessions on doing community work broadly. So if a community member is conducting the interviews, they may yield different kinds of data than conducted by an outside researcher because of the community member's positionality and relationship to interviewees. A photo voice project where youth photograph their own neighborhood and produce different evidence, and they produce different evidence is different than a survey designed by academics about that same neighborhood. Again, those who are positioned differently ask different questions in and of the field. So those who have a different relationship to their community doing a photo voice project may illuminate different things. Participatory mapping makes local knowledge legible in ways that academics may not may not understand. Action planning workshops do something most researchers do not get to. They put the findings back in the hands of the people that they're about to ask. So I encourage you to visit the QEM Hub and to see some of these in particular methods in action, to visit the March website, where you can see folks like Dr. Catherine Ye at the Dream Project at UT Austin, where parents become the teachers in the community and they introduce the concepts to the community, and in turn they interview families about mathematics. So you can see in her project where those who are doing the work, who are rooted in the communities, have different sight, not just about the mathematics, but about how people shape mathematics teaching and learning. This work led to a redistribution of both power and who is seen as knowledgeable in math and who is a knower and doer of math. It becomes more than just a subject to be housed and taught in schools. Mathematics becomes a meaningful cultural artifact of the community. Next slide, please. So if there are two things the implementation in the implementation literature that you can't skip, they are these two. Invest in relationships before you start research design. So relationship should be prioritized with research design, and build the action into the project from day one, not just as something aspirational, but build it into your budget. Make space for the action to take place while the research is happening. The other things on this list, while important, like flexible participation, structure, skill building, sustainability, ongoing reflexivity, and continuous power negotiation, those things are important, but they serve the first two commitments. So I think it's important to know that projects that shortcut the relationship phase lose legitimacy. They lose the essence of PAR. And projects that treat action as optional lose the community. The rest of these strategies are how you hold the rest of the project together once you have those two things right. So quickly, let's turn our attention back to the Flint scenario. So if we were going to set up a Y-PAR project, we know that it's going to be led by youth, maybe at a local youth center or via some local community group. Let's imagine that you're a researcher and you are tasked to generate authentic questions related to the issues facing these students in Flint. As researchers, we should always be listening to the questions and issues to crystallize. And so if you were working with a group of young people on a YPAR project regarding the Flint water crisis, what could be some possible questions that you and the youth could come together around and create an action-oriented question or set of questions? So again, we'll give you all about 30 seconds to think. And then as ideas come to mind in about 30 seconds, we'll encourage folks to share. All right, so feel free to use the chat. How do you envision your community now, next, and beyond? Yes, thinking about the power of young people, thinking about the future, the beyond. All right, well, for the sake of time, thank you. Feel free to continue to add those to the chat. We'll briefly share what we came up with as an example PAR question that could be addressed. So we came up with, what do we want decision makers to know that they clearly don't? And how do we hold them accountable to restore safe water? So notice in this question, the youth are making a choice to think about makers and the structural issues that may be ignored, and they're going to offer their perspective as young people in the community. And then they move to the action piece around holding them accountable to restore safe water. So just a brief introduction to PAR that scratches the surface. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Naomi, who will talk a little bit about CBR.
Thanks, Toya. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the third method, which is community-based research, or CBR. So CBR emerged from a shared frustration that communities, particularly low-income communities, and those from historically marginalized communities, sort of bore the burden of being research subjects without receiving proportionate benefit. So CBR is a comprehensive approach in which researchers actively partner with communities to investigate issues that are meaningful and relevant to them. And their origins are therefore not just intellectual, but also they're ethical, and they're rooted in a demand that research relationships be as just as the outcomes that they seek to produce. So I am going to speak specifically about CBPR. So CBPR is a under the CBR umbrella, but it's a structured approach that emphasizes equitable partnerships with community members serving as co-researchers rather than participants. And you see, you're going to consistently hear some of the same terms throughout this webinar about genuine and authentic partnerships, sharing power, co-knowledge creation, expertise, and responsibility. And it's really foregrounding the quality and the equity of partnerships. And CBPR has origins in public health, education, sociology, and community organizing. So for those who might not be familiar with sort of PAR and CBPR, you may be wondering what the differences are. So really quickly, it probably will take, some learning, some reading, some trying to understand, looking at some projects, but PAR emphasizes social transformation and action through this iterative cycle of research and reflection, whereas CBPR emphasizes the equitable collaboration and sustainable outcomes. And so they really focus on ensuring that research benefits the community and that it builds capacity. So CBPR tends to foreground quality and equity of the partnership, whereas PAR kind of foregrounds structural transformation. And so both approaches share principles of like community engagement, respect for local knowledge, and ethical collaboration, but really they differ in the primary focus and the intended outcomes. And so keeping with sort of the format with the other two sort of methods, just really thinking about the core principles of CBPR, right? So I'm going to put them on the screen. I'm not going to read through all of them, but, think about CBPR relationships or partnerships, can develop their own principles and tenets of engagement. But there are a set of core principles, which are the ones in front of you, that were developed by Barbara Israel and colleagues who were really well known for her work in CBPR. And some of these are really kind of the most commonly used, right? So I think to just highlight a couple of those. So like the first one, recognizes the community as a unit of identity. And this doesn't matter whether the community is defined in geographical, racial, ethnic, or other terms. The community is the unit of identification. And then moving down to sort of fosters co-learning and capacity building among partners, achieving balance between knowledge generation and intervention for the benefit of all partners, and really thinking about this idea of systems development using sort of the cyclical and iterative process, very similar to what was discussed earlier, but just the focus being much more on the community as participating in the research and not just as participants. So you will notice a great deal of similarity and overlap with the principles of RPP and PAR. And this is not by accident, right? We're talking about community research or research with the communities. So what we really want to do is hope to drive home the point that conducting research with communities needs to be based on respect, mutual benefit, co-learning, and equitable partnerships. This is not the traditional sort of academic researcher model. So keeping with the format of sort of thinking about the Flint water crisis, to sort of illustrate our three methodologies, I'm going to talk about how one might utilize CBPR to address community issues. And so what I encourage you to do is I kind of give you a little bit of background, which are in the bullets, to really start thinking about already kind of what kinds of CBR influenced questions, research questions might you ask. So we know that the Flint water crisis has been devastating and that the full impact of experiencing this crisis may never be fully understood, at least maybe not in the next few years. However, there's a broad consensus that children face significant risks for both immediate and long-term adverse health effects. So beyond the physical consequences, the water crisis has also resulted in concerning psychological effects among youth. Notably, reports of feeling anger, distrust, and resentment toward various government agencies. So, in thinking about just those, sort of three bullets, if you were using CBPR methods to engage youth in Flint, what would be some of the questions that you might explore, or even some of the methods that you might use to explore these questions? And so I'm not going to give you 30 seconds, I'm going to give you 15. And then you can start putting some things into the chat. All right. Do we have anyone who might want to take a swing, take a shot? So let's see, were you involved in making that decision? What processes were adopted to engage the community? Correct. Listening sessions in their spaces. What is working well in your community? Awesome. So just as a matter of time, we're going to highlight one of the questions that we came up with, or actually, this was a question that was the actual research question in an article that I will reference in a moment. So the question, so this particular project was exploring how youth view the impact of consuming the contaminated water on their health, and to elicit their recommendations on how to address the crisis and to rebuild trust in the community between policymakers, government officials, and the youth. And so if you're interested in this particular project that focused on that CBPR sort of question, I did put the link to the article in the resources. You can take a look. So on the next slide, I'm going to go over some of the common and uncommon CBPR methods that's used by researchers. So, when you look at this slide, you'll see some very standardized kind of methods. Surveys, you might see mixed methods, action research, participatory evaluation. And so I'm just going to make quick points about this. So for surveys, I think what would be different in a CBPR project is the co-design the surveys with community partners and collaborating throughout the research process. So this is not about designing a survey and then just getting feedback. This is co-designing together and taking input and voices in the design and the implementation. So we see asset mapping. So community explores, describes, maps its assets, and then uses them to develop solutions to issues within the community. So similar to a strengths-based approach. We're probably familiar with community advisory boards. The important piece here is to ensure that the initiatives are culturally relevant, equitable, and responsive to the needs of the communities they serve. Mixed methodology. The researchers in the article I just mentioned on the last slide had some quantitative information, but they collected youth views through focus groups. And we've talked about action research. Toya mentioned that. Participatory evaluations, very similar to surveys in that communities co-design the evaluation questions, the methods, and the criteria, ensuring that the outcomes reflect their priorities and values. And then popular education is not as common as the other methods, but it's becoming much more popular. And so this method connects personal experiences to these broader issues and empowers community members to really critically analyze and act on the problems that they face. And it really focuses on critical dialogue between the partners, shared leadership, and community empowerment. So next slide, and I am going to end my sort of brief overview of CBPR by saying it can be a really long, windy road. If you want quick results, this is probably not the methodology for you. However, if you're up for the challenge and really want to make some change, some transformation in communities, then here are some strategies to really think about that can lead to successful implementation of CBPR. So the first would be team composition, right? Because this directly influences the research's legitimacy, the relevance, and the impact. So you really want to think about capacity aligned participation, right? So structuring partnerships so that both academic and community partners contribute in ways that match their skills, their resources, and interests. And so that helps to ensure equitable engagement and mutual learning. And as you think about resource allocation in these team compositions, keep in mind it's not always just about budgeting. It's about being strategic, equitable, and the community-driven distribution of assets to empower those communities and to ensure sustainability. When we think about the next one, tools and instruments. So each partnership has different needs and priorities. And so it's important to keep in mind that whichever tools or instruments that you choose, that the community voices must be present at every stage. And the all important sort of data, right? And thinking about data in three different ways. So data interpretation in CBPR cannot be a one-sided exercise. It has to be a shared, co-created process. When we think about data dissemination, traditional academic dissemination methods like journal publications or conference talks often lacks accessibility for lay audiences. And so in CBPR, the goal is to ensure that community members can understand, they can validate, and they can act on these findings. And so you must think about dissemination in a very different way. And then finally, sort of data ownership. So CBPR involves shared data ownership, right? It's not just owned by one particular party, it's owned by the partnerships, by the collaboration. As we go to sort of the feedback loops, so the cyclical kind of participatory model inherently suited to continuous feedback loops. And so it creates this dynamic, adaptive process where research and action kind of evolve together in response to the community needs. And then finally, sustainability. So CBPR is widely recognized for its potential to promote social sustainability by building local capacity, fostering trust, and ensuring that research outcomes are relevant and actionable with the community context or within the community context. But that's not enough. So it also requires long-term research and evaluation, technical expertise, and infrastructure development, and in some cases, policy integration. And so I'm going to pass it to Tori to begin wrapping up. But first, she's going to discuss some common mistakes that we hope everyone who's interested in doing research with the community will avoid. So Tori?
Thank you. At this point in the presentation, you have heard many important considerations in terms of research with community. And so we want you to keep that in mind as you think about your own work. As you think about questions that you might have for this particular presentation, we want to invite you to go ahead and start queuing those up in the Q&A if indeed you have them, so that we can manage our time and try to address as many as possible. I do also want to note, as the engineer in the group, that these are principles that are applicable across disciplines. So this series is specific to STEM education and social and behavioral sciences, but it's also applicable. These principles are also applicable to other STEM disciplines, certainly like engineering. As a civil engineer, a lot of our work is with community. And so these are important considerations to think about. Engineers at large are designing for people and communities, whether that's directly or indirectly. And so the principles are applicable. It's certainly something that we'd like for you to keep in mind, regardless of the scientific discipline in which you are working. But as you implement these strategies, as Naomi said, it is important to avoid some of these common mistakes. And we'll just talk to a few of them. The first we've alluded to already. It's prioritizing a timeline over trust. So the idea here is that building relationships and trust is critical. We've said it a few times. We won't be able to say it enough. You really can't rush the process. So you want to plan your project's timing accordingly, because Meaningful, sustained change takes time, bottom line. And it often exceeds the timeline of a single grant or project. So you have to think about what you can do in a particular time frame when your goal is to meaningfully engage in authentic partnerships with community. Build in time for what you'll need in that project's context, but also think about building in long-term follow-up, even if it's informal, because that is part of being a responsible partner in this kind of work. The second one is this idea of just always taking and not giving, because true partnership is not extractive. A researcher cannot come in and just take data or take perspectives or take whatever it is that's needed for a particular study without giving anything. Again, we've said it multiple times, but think about how will the community benefit? Plan for that, and certainly make it known as you go about carrying out the project. The third one I wanted to mention is not budgeting for compensation. So very few of us as researchers work without pay. Researchers are paid for what they do and the expertise that they bring, and community partners should be also. So as you plan budgets for proposals, an honorarium can help to affirm the value of the participants' time and the expertise that they are bringing to these processes. Many communities have been over-researched, and so there is a need to provide an incentive for their participation. So consider that as you are planning to implement this work. Another is forgetting the importance of proper representation. Again, something that has been alluded to throughout this presentation. There really is a wealth of knowledge that's available on the importance of representation. Subject matter expertise and knowledge of the project is what we tend to go to, but that's not the only skill that's needed on the team. Representation matters. I know as a parent, I haven't taken too much advice from people who aren't also parents. My sons are athletes. They don't tend to be trained by people who don't know the sport in which they're engaging. So you want to ensure that there is representation for all important aspects of a project, and that the representatives have authentic roles that include power, because they are the ones that are going to represent their communities. And you always, always want to ensure that the communities are represented accurately. For the sake of time, I'll move on, but there's a lot more that we should say there. We also want to caution you against ignoring cultural context. There is a need to confront biases, to overcome language barriers, to be ready to learn and adapt, and require flexibility. Lastly, I think the last one that I'll mention is limiting findings to academic journals and conferences. So traditionally, when we say dissemination in an academic setting, you're thinking only publications in peer-reviewed journals or presenting at academic conferences. And all of those are, of course, important. But in research with community, you also want to ask questions like, who needs to know this? In what format should this information be shared? And through what channels? The answer is almost always going to point you beyond an academic outlet. So you've seen in the infographics prior to now, things like digital storytelling, or you might consider policy briefs, community presentations outside of academic conferences. Just always remember that community members who participated in the research really deserve to receive the findings first and be able to provide input before this is shared with academic audiences. If the community is truly co-investigating, then the community organizations, the youth researchers, whomever it might be, should be named in these publications and reports and presentations if they indeed have been contributors. So just important considerations to keep in mind. And as we go to the next slide, I want to also make sure you are seeing the resources that have been referenced throughout. So in this slide and the one that follows, there are resources for readings, special issues, quick guides, and projects that illustrate these approaches for working with community. I do want to note, depending on the source, again, this is something that you've heard probably throughout QEM Heroes presentations from the beginning, depending on the funding source to which you are going, you always want to ensure that your theoretical underpinnings align with the priorities of the funder to which you're submitting. So just keep that in mind as we recommend some of these resources, but all of them are incredible. They're they can be incredibly helpful. The links will be here as you gain access to the slides. I think one in particular, which is going to be the last link that you see in that last, I guess, yellowish, goldish shaded section, is it demonstrates kind of that overlap that Naomi was mentioning between some of the methods. It's community-based participatory action research. So an interesting guide toward looking at some of the commonalities and how to implement that in your work. So keep that in mind as we move forward. Let's see. Next, we just want to do just a few things. We have some opportunities queued up to prompt reflection, but I think you've had a good opportunity to do that with the Flint water crisis as a context. So let me just pitch for you all the remaining webinars in this series. Again, this series is specific to STEM education, applied STEM education more specifically, and behavioral sciences. But the next topics coming up will focus on mixed methods research design and analysis. That's a big topic. So that'll be 2 parts over the next 2 months, so July and August. And then you'll see the topics that we intend to also address in the fall. So we invite your participation with those. And then, Christine, I will hand things over to you after just saying a quick thank you for your time and attention today. You have our email addresses listed there. Fellows are available for office hours to address any specific questions that you might have about your work, how you might implement some of these strategies in your work. We've also listed the areas of expertise that at least the 4 presenters today have, but there is a much larger cohort of fellows with expertise in a variety of disciplines and methodologies and approaches, so feel free to reach out to us if you have any more specific questions. Christine, over to you.
Thank you so much for an exciting and informative presentation. As you see on this closing slide, you can find the email addresses of each presenter and their subject matter expertise. The QEM events page QR code will take you to the registration page for all of our upcoming webinars. The Heroes webpage will connect you with all of our Heroes Fellows so you can find someone to contact for any number of services and resource sharing in your grant development efforts and your STEM community participatory action building research. And the webinar feedback form, which I will link right now, is an opportunity for you to give feedback on our webinars, and we encourage you to please fill that out so we can improve in the future. And I'll resubmit that. So thank you so much for your participation and attendance today. We have 2 minutes until the hour. If there are any questions in the chat or Q&A, I don't see any.
I just want to say that if you have attended the previous webinars, you should already have access to the QM Resource Hub. And if you go to the QEM website, scroll to the bottom in the footer, there's a link that you can just click on that will give you direct access to the QM Resource Hub.
Thank you so much, Tarina. And to everyone, I wish you a great day. And thank you so much for attending our presentation today. Oh, we do have one question. We have a minute to take it in the Q&A. Suppose you want to understand something that you find reprehensible, for example, misogyny. You find a population somewhere in the world where men dominate women, often brutally. Do you attempt to conduct research in partnership with these people? Do you need a different approach instead?
So I know we're running out of time. I don't know if this response will directly answer your question, but I'll tell you, for a long time, I did research on IPV, intimate partner violence. And my last project, I brought in, not together, but I brought in survivors as well as perpetrators, because if you only have one perspective, then it's hard for a community to really think about social transformation. So you need to also understand the perspectives, the lived experiences, the understanding of folks whose behavior you might find unsavory, but they have reasons whether or not you accept those reasons or you agree with them, but it really is about understanding how people are thinking about the particular situations, and then trying to respond based on the information that they give you. So I know that wasn't directly related to kind of this misogynistic, but I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of the fact that I think to be thorough in your research, there are opportunities to get information from both sides of a particular issue or action. I don't know if anybody else has a follow.
It just might also include, I mean, Naomi, that was perfect. It also might include co-researchers being the people who talk to the people who you find reprehensible, because that can be a very difficult way to build trust. And that trust is part of kind of solution finding.
And also co-researching with folks who maybe were batterers or who were in that particular situation, so that they can give you some insight in terms of what might be some strategies or methods that may work with certain populations or certain ways of thinking.
Thank you so much for those insights. And once again, thank you so much for attending today. We hope to see you at a future QEM Heroes webinar. Thank you so much.